I think right around the country, you've had the drought, you've had bushfires now, you've been hit with this pandemic. As Premier of New South Wales, you've had a torrid 6 months, and I think even those who don't live in the state would commend your work ethic. On the other hand, so much of the country is idle or on significantly reduced hours, and of course that breeds its own frustrations. Tomorrow, you'll have a meeting with the Prime Minister and other premiers. Do we expect we'll see an actual timetable of an easing of restrictions as opposed to just a statement of principles?
Oh, look, I think we can, Peter. I think the Prime Minister's been very clear about that. He's been very clear to all of us about that. But what I love about the path forward is that it gives us an obvious sequence as to what should be the next category of things where we can ease restrictions. And I think, you know, there might be variations of weeks between states and combinations of things, because obviously you can't really compare New South Wales to WA or the Northern Territory. And that's the beauty of the Federation. The Federation works because it acknowledges national unity, but also that the states have various things they've got to consider. And I think what National Cabinet will do very appropriately is give us great guidance on the next category of restrictions and a time frame that, give or take, all of us will be able to adopt. Now, as I said, there could be variations of weeks between us and slight variations in how we get out of things, but on the whole, I think it will be a very important discussion and a very important set of principles, and also, I think, a time frame. And certainly, you know, in New South Wales, we probably have to be much more cautious than any other state. We have a denser population, the highest population. You know, just a month ago, we had 50 cases a day, and then towards the middle of March, we had 200 cases a day. Now, that would have turned us into a New York or an Italy, and we certainly don't want to go back to that.
Well, there's talk today that you want to bring schools back sooner rather than later, perhaps as early, some say it's in the next couple of weeks. Is that your priority, schools before perhaps broadly other businesses?
Yeah, and Peter, if I can be very crude, our economic analysis, Treasurer Perrottet has done a great job with his team. If you look at what is the lowest health risk but highest economic uplift, it's actually getting children back at school full time, because it means the parents can be more productive, it means people are dropping off and picking up, and the businesses that support school communities are active. Education sector itself is a big employer. So, interestingly, what turned out to have the lowest health risk also has the highest economic uplift. And from Monday, kids will start to go back in New South Wales, and for the first 2 weeks, it'll be a staged approach. But we're hoping that if the next 2 weeks goes well, we'll have kids back by the end of May, hopefully. But again, what we've done to be extra cautious is get enough hygiene products, soap, make sure that there's tools available like thermometers if parents and school communities want to do temperature checks. Like, none of this is compulsory. But the approach we have in New South Wales, and which the Prime Minister supports, is that we always want to take steps forward. We never want to be in a position where once we ease a restriction, we go backwards. And that's why if you take a little bit of time, a couple of weeks in easing back to full-time education, it means you can put in place the staggered drop-off and pick-up times. You can make sure teachers have social distancing in the staff rooms, because we know the disease isn't really spreading from kids or amongst children, it's actually spreading amongst adults in the main. So if we can make sure our education system is ready, then once kids go back full-time, they should stay there full-time.
All right, there was a report on the front page of The Australian today from Professor Ian Hickey. His concern is the economic consequences as opposed to the virus health consequences. The economic consequences could cost 4 times the number of deaths from suicide than the actual virus itself, which is a strong argument to get the economy back up and running sooner rather than later. What does success look like to you? Are you saying that by June or July you want us to be back at work as we should be in New South Wales? Is it more likely it will be August that you see success? What's your time frame?
Yeah, well, to be perfectly honest, Peter, what we're doing in May is we've eased 3 major restrictions. So obviously children will be back at school full time, which means parents will be more productive. And we've already seen a greater activity of people working from their workplace as opposed to home. We've said that you can visit each other's households, 2 adults and kids at any one time. And we've also said that we're noticing more retail open, and we're encouraging businesses that can open their doors to do so. So what we'll do in May is collect the data and then make an assessment as to how fast we can go in June with easing further restrictions. So it really comes down to the data. If the number of new cases are manageable, well, then that gives us extra confidence to move more quickly. But I was heartened today. In the last few days, Dr. Kerry Chant, who's our medical officer, and myself have said we want to get test rates up above 8,000 midweek, because that's when the number of tests peak. In the last 24 hours, we had 10,900 people come forward and get tested with only 3 new cases. So that gives us cause for optimism. And once we get the data in about those changes, because sometimes a little bit of an easing of a restriction can have a dramatic effect on the number of cases. And I don't want to be in a situation where once you tell a business to open their doors, they're not going to do that unless they know they can keep their doors open. I don't want to ever be in a situation where once a business is open, you've told them then they've got to shut back down. And so what we're doing is talking about what does a COVID-safe business look like, what does a COVID-safe school look like, what will a COVID-safe public transport network look like, to give people confidence that once we ease a restriction, there's no going back. I mean, that's what success looks like. I hope we don't find ourselves in a situation where we've got to go back and put restrictions back in place. But that's why I'll be basing our decision-making in New South Wales definitely on what the National Cabinet determines, but also specifically on the data I'm collecting about our own citizens and what they're doing.
Well, as I said at the top of the show, I think there's no one around the country who can't see how hard you've personally worked. As I said, you've had the triple whammy of all of those related issues and now this crisis. But there's been a lot of criticism for the last couple of months, not just over this coronavirus, but you've had criticism. Your Minister for Police and Emergency Service took off to Europe at the height of the bushfires, when we all know the calamity of Ruby Princess, and some criticisms of your Health Minister. And now we've got this unedifying blue between 2 of your ministers, Andrew Constance and John Barilaro, who both looked like they wanted to leave state politics for Canberra. That's not going to happen. Is it time for a reshuffle?
Oh, look, Peter, all the things you mentioned are unfortunate, and nobody likes to see any organisation or any extended family, in our case, airing its dirty laundry. But I've always said, notwithstanding the specific examples you raised, I've always said we will have a reshuffle in New South Wales post the worst of the pandemic. I certainly don't feel that any of us should be focused on what jobs we're getting when a lot of people are unemployed, and that's what keeps me awake at night, Peter, I have to say. I worry about the number of people who've lost their jobs or had reduced hours or don't have an income. That's what's stressing me out, because obviously the health side of the virus, the pandemic, we've been dealing with successfully. And now the harder stuff is how do we ease restrictions, which puts pressure on the health system, but has sufficient economic activity to allow people to get back to work and to also keep their jobs or get new jobs. And I think post-COVID, the world will look different. I think a lot of businesses have been able to innovate and restructure, but a lot haven't. And it's our role in government to inspire and innovate and think of ways in which we can get jobs going during this time, because we know JobKeeper, which I think was the best policy that I've ever seen in public life for a long time. But JobKeeper has an end date, and we need to make sure as many people as possible are working and back in jobs before that time frame ends.
I want to get to some points on reform, because your Treasurer has had quite a lot to say in that area. But just before I do, one of the biggest issues obviously in New South Wales has been Ruby Princess. Did you ask yourself, staff or public servants or police, indeed anyone, did you ask why on earth passengers were offloaded from this ship at 2:30 in the morning? Because that's a red flag to me.
Oh, absolutely a red flag. And I still don't have the answer to that, because it's abnormal for any ship to come in at that time. And at the time, as you know, there was the cruise company itself involved, but also a number of different agencies, both state and federal. And that's why I've asked Brett Walker, who's quite non-partisan. He's certainly not our side of politics, but an eminent person who will get to the bottom of it. And I think people want answers and deserve answers. We had 13 other cruise ships that came and went without any issue, and I think the public deserves and wants to know what happened, what went wrong here. And I'm the first one to say from day one that all the authorities involved should have done better. And since that incident, obviously the protocols have changed between on border protection. And, you know, I've been the first one to say that all of us need to take on board what went wrong and be accountable.
But will there be consequences? Because I lived not far from Circular Quay. I've never seen a ship unload in the middle of the night, and I don't think anyone has. So will there be consequences if it would appear out of the inquiry when that lands on your desk that rules were bent in relation to this cruise ship for whatever reason?
Well, potentially, Peter, and I don't want to preempt what's going on, but as you know, the police and even biosecurity have been involved in criminal investigations. So I knew that because criminal investigations were being considered by police and also by other federal agencies, that we may not get to the bottom of what happened in a timely way, which is why I asked Brett Walker to do a commission of inquiry. So at least we will get this information in a timely way. I've asked him to give us the report. I think it's mid-August. So at least by then we will have those answers, because
maybe don't do your reshuffle until then. I suspect don't do your reshuffle until then. You may have other changes in the office. I want to ask you about.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about reform. Can we move on to reform? Because your Treasurer and Liberal Party deputy wants to, or we believe he wants to, scrap stamp duty and payroll tax in favour of increased land taxes. That's far more efficient, I would suspect. How keen are you to reform state taxes? Are we talking about substantial reforms like an increase to the GST?
Well, Peter, I don't want to throw a spanner in the works, but the short answer is absolutely. I mean, my Treasurer and myself, and look at our history as a government, we're always up for reform. We don't want to burden taxpayers further beyond COVID. I don't think anyone wants to see that, but we have to think of innovative ways in which we can be more efficient. And all of those things you mentioned should be on the table. And we also have to use this opportunity, which only happens once in a generation or once in a century, where we have really good coordination at a national level with all the state leaders. Now, that allows us to cut through the red tape. I mean, you know what the COAG process is like. It's bureaucrats. It's like a bureaucrat's. Well, I shouldn't say that, but you know, it's like red tape on red tape on red tape. But what I think the Prime Minister's done very successfully, and what we've done together, by putting aside any differences, is get rid of all that red tape, and as leaders feel empowered enough to make decisions which impact our nation and our states without...
Yeah, but right now, Premier, the Prime Minister's sitting there with a big chequebook. The test will be when it comes to some of the harder decisions, I think, like tax reform and indeed the political double whammy of tax reform and including perhaps an increase to the GST. That will be the real test of this national unity.
It absolutely will, and I'm one for shared responsibility. I'll put up my hand and say to my citizens, we'll be able to get rid of all these inefficient taxes if we go down this path. And I think, ironically, Peter, we don't always deserve it, but I think at this point in time, trust in government is probably the highest it's been in a long time, because people are looking to government to keep them safe, and we have to respect and respond to the community's trust by firstly keeping them safe, making sure they can work and earn a living, but also by showing them a pathway to the future, by rewarding the community for their support, by being gutsy and courageous and making decisions for them, even if it has some negative consequences for us personally. I think it's really important to take this opportunity to be gutsy and to forge a pathway forward. I mean, Australia has demonstrated, and I feel very proud of this, Australia has demonstrated that when we come together, we can show the world how to deal with something which has been dealt with far more horrifically in other nations. We should really feel proud of what we've achieved, and this is really because our community is stuck with us. I mean, it's one thing...
Well, and the people have done the work.
100%. It's not, I mean, as leaders, we've said this is what we think should happen, and the community's embraced it. And I can't tell you what that feels like. I've never felt like this in public life, to have the community actually listen and respond. That's what's been the success. It's not politicians, it's actually people respecting the decision-making and respecting the expert advice and taking it. And imagine what we're capable of. If we're capable of this, I think the sky's the limit. I feel very optimistic about the future. I feel gutsy and courageous. I feel as though all of us as leaders shouldn't care about criticism we might, because as you know, the small minority will always bark. And I'm over that, frankly. I'm over the whinges. We should all be about courageousness, courage and the path forward, and the public has inspired us to do that because of their support and the way in which they've conducted themselves.
Good on you, Gladys Berejiklian. You've had your own sort of corona awakening. Thanks for your time tonight, and good luck with the months ahead.